Hello and welcome back to Lecture 2 of History 1378. I noticed a lot of you have already started viewing it. We had, I think, a couple hundred views already of Lecture 1. I sent it out on PeopleSoft email. It'll also be up on Blackboard. All of us got together today, the TAs and I, and we discussed this. So all of this stuff is going to be available on Blackboard. I'll also send out emails on PeopleSoft as needed, but you won't have any problem getting access to this. You can also just go in and subscribe to the History 1378 YouTube channel, and then that way I think you get notified when a new one is up or something like that. So it looks like everything's going well so far. So this is Lecture 2. We started yesterday by going over the syllabus a little bit, and then we started talking about what was going on in the United States in the aftermath of the Civil War. So just to kind of refresh our memories, this is the syllabus, which will be on Blackboard as well, but you can also find it here at this address. And I will update it as needed. And there's a lot of other stuff on Blackboard too. I mentioned in the first lecture, information about the books from Nunn McGinney. If you have any questions about the books, contact Nunn McGinney. I think it's documents@nunnmcginney.com, but it should be on their webpage. And there should also be a document on Blackboard from them discussing any questions, like kind of an FAQ kind of thing. I think there'll be a statement up there, a UH statement about whatever changes have been made this semester because of the COVID crisis and everything else. So anyway, this is the syllabus. These are the names of the TAs. There's information about the books, which you can get at the bookstore. If you don't want to go to campus, you can get it directly online and get an access code that way. And then over here, grading, testing, all that kind of stuff. And down here is the goal. It's the plan we have right now. The information we're going to talk about in a particular week, the subjects, the topics, and then what reading is expected from the book. So that should all be fairly easy to figure out. And if not, you can always, again, contact the TAs or contact me, and we'll be checking Blackboard regularly, and you should, check in on it on a regular basis too. And then yesterday I started, and I'll have these up all the time. This is actually the majority of what you looked at, with me in the corner here. Talking about the class, we talked about the aftermath of the Civil War, the major issues on how to rebuild, to reconstruct the United States. So you had this political reconstruction where these southern states came in really without much punishment. So the people who ran the South after the Civil War were basically the same people who ran it before the war, who controlled the Southern economy. They were planters, they were slave owners. And there really isn't really much of a change. They briefly had been punished, but then in 1868, the president, Andrew Johnson, who had succeeded Lincoln, pardoned all the planters. And one thing I didn't mention when I talked about the Freedmen's Bureau, the Freedmen's Bureau's promise was that ex-slaves would have access to land, 40 acres and a mule. And most of that land came from land that was seized. You don't make new land, so that land was coming from planters who had it taken. Once they were pardoned, when you're pardoned, it's like you didn't commit a crime, you didn't do anything wrong. And so no longer were they prohibited from owning that land. It had not been taken, it had been taken when they were considered treasonous. Now that they've been pardoned, there's a due process clause, right? You can't deprive somebody of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Well, they've been pardoned, so there's no crime. So no longer can you seize that land from planters to provide for the Freedmen's Bureau, for any other kind of land reform movement. So, as I said, out of 3.5 million or so slaves in the South, only 30 to 40,000 really had access to land. So, and then you had the emergence of groups like the KKK and the Night Riders, really violent repression, lynchings, and so forth. So, the possibility of creating kind of a new racial society in the United States failed from the outset. We talked a little bit about the Western movement, and especially the removal of the extermination of Indians there. And all this stuff is in the book. I told you, I said, in the first exam, right? In the first lecture, read, I'm looking through it, and, I go into stuff in way more detail. There's a lot more to it than what I'm talking about here. And so if you want to get a much fuller picture, definitely make sure you stay on time with the reading. So there's a lot about that, but to make it short, you had these tribes which had sovereignty. They were, actually kind of autonomous states. They weren't part of the United States yet. The U.S. initially in the early 1800s, because it wanted this land for agriculture, for plantations, for things like cotton, just removed Indians. They drove them away. The infamous Trail of Tears is the best example of that. And then after the war, in order to create this national network from coast to coast, it was important to remove these Indians, and especially when you had this discovery of gold in places like the Black Hills of South Dakota, which led to the famous Custer's Last Stand, but even more than that, the American government simply violated these treaties. They just ignored tribal sovereignty. They took all this land, and that led to the so-called Indian Wars, the destruction of the attempted destruction of Indian culture, of Native culture, and even things like the Dawes Act, where land which had been held, in common, was taken away and parceled out in the Severalty Act, in several different pieces and given away. And that, the end of it was kind of at Wounded Knee, which this brutal massacre of the Lakota there. So all that stuff is happening in this period. And then the last thing I brought up, we talked about a little bit, which I'll start talking about more in this class and here in lecture 2, is the Triumph of Capitalism, and to kind of, again, go back and refresh and again, read the book on this, because there's a lot to it, and there's no way I could cover everything that's in the book, right? So we're just going to kind of give you the ideas, the major ideas, and some of the information about it. But it's really important, I think, to understand it in more depth, more detail. So prior to the Civil War, there's essentially 2 different societies in the United States. You have a Southern society, which is based on agriculture and, of course, slave labor. And the South produces goods for trade. So they produce cotton and tobacco and rice and, all kinds of things like that, sugar, much of which they sell abroad to Europe, especially. So they're part of a global economy in that way. They're part of this global capitalist network in that they create commodities and they sell them for foreign trade. But it's not like the North. In the North, what you have is the emergence throughout the 1800s, the 19th century, and especially after the Civil War, of an industrial capitalist society, an industrial capitalist economy. And that is an economy based on capital, which I kind of talked about the other day. Capital isn't just money you pull out of your pocket. It's capital is what you invest to build something, to produce something. You make a factory, you build machines, and in that way you create goods which you then sell, and you get a profit, and you reinvest that. It has to keep growing, right? I don't know if it's true or not that sharks have to keep moving or they'll die, but I always use that analogy, right? It's like that. You have to keep growing. If capital stops growing, then you have economic problems on your hands, and we'll talk about that. 1929 is a great example of that, and 2020 is seeing that as well, right? We just had this massive shutdown and the economy cratered, right? So capital has to keep moving. You have to keep investing more capital, getting more capital. And so you saw the emergence of that, the triumph of that. And, I put that let me just, briefly put it up again. We put this chart up, remember, so that it makes it pretty clear looking at that why the North, won the Civil War. It had just this overwhelming advantages and railroads and iron and wealth and, banking and factories and all that kind of stuff. That's capitalism. Right? And the South was mostly an agrarian society. It had minor, it had 15% of the factories. So only 50% of the factories were in the South. And so is a huge gulf, a vast difference between the North and the South, which meant that it was almost, inevitable that the North was going to eventually succeed because of that overwhelming dominance of capital and of industry, right? So with the Civil War over now, the United States can have a national economy based on industrial capitalism, based on capital. Southern wealth, remember, was based more on property. Northern wealth tends to be now based more on capital and building things, building factories, building machines to run factories, building railroads, building canals, having commerce, stuff used to sell other stuff is really vital. And so that's why you have it. So you have this emergence, this triumph of capital. The people who control the economy and tend to more or less control the political system too are those who control capital and control the means of production, which are the things you use to make stuff. And it's also important from the very beginning to keep in mind that in this move toward national capitalism, this global economy, this national economy, I'm sorry, that having the government involved is really important. A lot of times what you hear is that, the government has to stay out of the economy, businesses, do things on their own. That's not historically the way it's been done. The government's always been deeply involved. I mentioned like the 1828 tariffs. The government gave land to railroads. Governments decide which, businesses might succeed, which might fail. They impose tariffs in order to help particular businesses. The example I use, they built stadiums, right? So, pretty much every major league stadium anywhere in the United States has been built with public money. So the public, they take tax money and they build a stadium, but it's used by a private business, right? So we don't get dividend checks from, the Astros or the Texans or whoever, right? This concept is often called socialized debt and private profit, which means the debt, the amount of money you spend is socialized, which means the public pays for it, but the profit is private, right? So, and that's the way that capitalism has been structured. It needs to have this government involvement to protect certain businesses. And in the 19th century, it protected industry. That's what the 1828 tariffs was about, to help northern industries. And the effect of it was to harm southern agriculture, which is why in 1828, South Carolinians, the leaders of South Carolina, were talking about secession already, 30 some years before, they finally did it, right? And the other element we talked about was kind of connected to that is industrialization and incorporation. Capitalism involves industry, so you have this transition then from small businesses, artisans, people who make stuff, maybe make shoes, you can make furniture, whatever, or they're kind of small businesses which operate maybe in a shed or with, just a journeyman, an apprentice, family members, that kind of thing. That transitions to kind of what we often call merchant capitalism, where somebody might come and say, hey, make 20 pairs of shoes and I'm going to put them on my wagon and go sell them elsewhere. Or make some furniture and then I'll go to the town next to me and sell it, right? You're not doing something specifically by order. And then eventually what happens is that somebody will go to factory with machines and make that stuff there. So you can make it in much greater mass, in much greater quantity, and it'll cost less as well. And so what that'll do is drive a lot of those smaller artisans out of business, right? Now, those artisans, it wasn't that hard to organize their business. You had a family business, maybe a few employees, you bought the goods, you purchased the raw materials. If you're a shoemaker, you might have purchased the leather and whatever else you needed. You may have had the family, your wife or your kids, keeping the books or doing whatever. You can't do that with a major factory. So that leads to the triumph, again, of incorporation. There had been corporations before the Civil War, but they became really vitally important, as I said the other day, because it gives you access to huge amounts of capital. You can't really go to a bank and say, give me $100 million. Most banks don't have that. And the federal government, which will foster business, isn't going to, be able to operate at that level. So what you do is you incorporate and you sell parts of your business. You sell shares in it. And in that way, you have access to vast amounts of money, way more than you would otherwise, right? Because I can say I'm going to sell 1 million shares at however much money, and then all that comes in. And then even better, the beauty of it is that you're not responsible for that. So the amount of liability you have is limited to just what you put into it. So if you buy shares in my company and you invest $50,000 in my company, and my company is terrible, and we go out of business, and it's an absolute failure, you're out that money. If I borrowed that money from a bank, I would still owe the bank that money. But since I sold you shares, I don't owe you anything. I'm on the hook for what I personally, put into it. So it's a great advantage that way too. And you start to see more and more massive, huge corporations. They're just, immense, valued into the millions and then hundreds of millions of dollars, right? So with this, then you have vast wealth. Capitalism created vast wealth, and very quickly, something called the net national product, which is kind of the output of everything that's made, minus the worn out factories and machines and stuff like that. That's not good anymore. In 1870 was $6.2 billion. So it's already pretty big in 1870. But by 1900, it was $30 billion, like almost 5 times more. So there's this massive amount. So that, this economy now, by 1900, it was worth $30 billion. And, you can go online and find some kind of, site that will tell you what values are worth nowadays. So I didn't do that, but 30 billion in 1900 would be worth, I'm sure, an immense amount today. And by that time, also the United States in that process became the biggest industrial producer in the world. It had a bigger industrial output than any other country. Other areas grew. Banking grew. By 1860, there were about 1,500 banks. By 1900, there were over 13,000, and by 1920, 31,000. So banking is a vital part of capital too, right? Because they provide capital. You go for a loan, a small business loan, or some kind of loan like that. That's capital, right? So banks are really vital in this, and there's this massive increase. Insurance companies are the same thing. Banks by the early 1920s had $53 billion in assets. Remember, banks are privately held, so people own banks. So that's a massive investment, and generally a profitable one too, right? And then you had all kinds of other stuff, all kinds of businesses emerged in the later 19th and early 20th century. Machines that made canned goods like vegetables and fruit, streetcar motors, machines that made cigarettes. Farm equipment is big. John Deere, which is still around today, got started 150, 200 years ago making farm equipment, and people invested in that because, it's obviously going to be a good industry, an important industry. So all this stuff is going on. You have the emergence of an energy industry now. People start using a lot more coal than wood or water like they would have before. So all this stuff is happening in this period, and it leads to vast economic growth, but more for the North than for the South. If you look at like this, if you take $100 as the base income, like that's the base, right? So in the North, if you make $100, in the South, you're going to be worth about, much less than that, 70, 60, by the 1880s, 1890s, probably about half. So Southerners are much poorer than Northerners. And there's a lot of Northern investment in the South too. There's a lot of Northern banks and Northern speculators who have purchased, who've invested in the South, bought land or bought some kind of business or something like that. In class, I often use the example today of West Virginia. Now, I don't know what your particular image of West Virginia is, but West Virginia is a huge coal producing state. There's, obviously coal mines all over the place, which means it's worth a lot of money. Coal is a very valuable commodity. However, about 80 to 90% of West Virginia is owned by bankers from outside the state. So even though West Virginia has this very significant core of a wealthy commodity, their coal, the people there don't really benefit from it. Outsiders do. So that's going on too. That's really occurring. So you have this vast emergence of industrial capitalism. You have some people making immense amounts of wealth on it. Bankers, industrialists, people who own the railroads is the biggest one by far. Railroads. There's a whole section in chapter 1 on railroads, which you should really take a look at. And then you have the emergence of people like Carnegie, Rockefeller, oil companies, steel companies, which are going to be incredibly important in the 19th going into the 20th century. In the 20th century, was the century. If the 19th century is kind of the century of railroads, the 20th century is more a century of steel and oil and automobiles, because they use steel and oil right later. But steel and oil are really vital, and oil today, energy, is still obviously one of the most important businesses in the entire economy, the entire world, right? So just to kind of, and I could talk about this for a long time, but like I said, make sure you read the book. So just to kind of give you some examples of what I'm talking about, there's some data here which I think really kind of shows the emergence and the growth of industrial capitalism, right? So, and in some really important areas, you know, coal, steel, and then machinery. So coal production in 1870 was 20,000 tons a year. By 1900, 212,000. So there's this massive increase, over 10 times more. And then just 10 years later, it almost doubled, right, to 417,000 tons. So it's 417,000 times 2,000, whatever the math is there. Steel, which is going to become the very critical in the 20th century. Steel is probably the most important of these industrial products. In 1870, 14,000 tons a year, not that much. But by 1900, it was up to 303,000 tons a year, which is more than 20 times more. And then almost doubled again by 1910, 544,000 tons. So again, 544,000 times 2,000. And then machinery. The machines, you know, so you build factories, but you need machines to build factories, and you need machines to do the stuff in the factories, right? To produce the steel or textiles or whatever. So industrial machinery in 1870 was 117 million, not that much, right? But by 1910, it's 512 billion. So factories and machines and all that are over $500 billion by 1910. And again, if you figured out what that was in 2020 money, it would be just immense, right? It would be huge. So all of those things are part of this movement after the Civil War toward a capitalist industrial society. There's so much more in the book about this. So, you know, I would certainly encourage you to look at it, to read it closely, to look at the sections on, you know, kind of the amount of wealth, how it was distributed, because it's not distributed equally, and we're going to talk about that next. Look at the railroads, read about Carnegie and Rockefeller. All this stuff is really important to understand. And one of the ideas here is by understanding this, we kind of, I think, have a better sense of the way the economy is structured today. Obviously, it's, you know, we're not in 1910 anymore, and you have this service economy and software and mobile technology and cellular phones and all this kind of stuff. So that's very different. But the overriding structure is still very similar. You have major corporations which control vast segments of the economy, right? You don't have Carnegie and Rockefeller, but you got, you know, Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and people like that. So in that regard, it's still very similar. You have a fairly small number of people who control vast amounts of wealth and have accumulated power to go with it. You know, they control their businesses, but they also have a significant influence over politics and cultural life and everything else, right? And, you know, as we're taping this and watching it, we're going through this incredible series of crises, right? In 2020, you have COVID and kind of a massive economic crash. People are out of work. People are losing health insurance, evictions. The healthcare system isn't, you know, doing great. So this is like kind of a good historical lesson, because if you look back, you can see stuff very similar to this. I know you've heard already, who knows how many references to the influenza epidemic of 1918, 1919. So, you know, there is a sense, I think, a usefulness in learning history, right? Why do we learn history? To kind of see what happened in the past. We also learn to feel good about ourselves, right? We have these patriotic ideas about history and stuff like this. There's a lot of reasons you learn history, but maybe you can learn something useful from it as well. And so I think that to understand how these economic ideas were created and put into effect from the beginning is you know, it's useful, it's important. So and I'll be talking about that probably, you know, more as the semester goes on. So with that, what do we want to talk about next? Well, the economy changed dramatically. The United States economy is very different than it had been before the Civil War, right? You now have, more and more industry, more and more industrialization, this capitalist economy, banks. So the emergence of capital, the triumph of capital, you need access to money now, which means that, industry is going to be far more valuable than agriculture. You still need agriculture. The South is still producing, rice and tobacco and sugar and cotton and all that kind of stuff. Northern farmers are still growing massive amounts, massive acreage of wheat and corn and all that kind of stuff too. So agriculture is vital. But if you're looking to invest in something that's going to make huge money, then industry is more important. If you went to a banker, if a banker had two people in front of him and one wanted to invest in, railroads or a steel mill, and the other one wanted to, grow more cotton or grow more tobacco or whatever, then the banker would certainly, prefer to invest in industry, in a railroad or in a steel mill or some kind of raw materials or something like that, right? So it's massively changed. Now, that doesn't mean it's great for everybody, right? It's changed, but it also creates havoc in a lot of people's lives. And, again, in 2020, you can kind of see how economic and social problems can really upend people's lives. They'll lose their jobs, they lose their work. And so even though capitalist America created great wealth, I mean, you know about Carnegie, about Rockefeller, all these very wealthy people, Jay Gould and the railroads, Vanderbilt and the railroads, they're all many, many, many people. But it left a lot of people behind. And that's kind of the nature of what these economic transitions do, these transformations to capitalism do. So I want to talk a little bit about that, capitalist America and its challenges, because not everybody was all that keen on it. I'm going to actually start with this phrase down here. I don't know why I have it here instead of up there, but this period is often referred to as the Gilded Age. And that's a term that has actually been used more lately than it has in a long time, the Gilded Age. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. It was a term created by a very famous American, somebody you're almost certainly familiar with, Mark Twain. Twain, is probably the most famous American novelist, but he was also very much involved in politics. He was an anti-imperialist. He was against America going to other places and fighting wars and things like that. But in the 1870s, he also wrote a book with a friend of his whose name I lost it, called The Gilded Age. Now, if you've ever done art or anything like that, a gild is a nice covering, often gold, that you put on the outside of something to make it look good. Now, the particular thing you're covering may not be in great shape, right? It kind of might be nasty or marked up or infested with termites or who knows what, but the gild makes it look good. And that was Twain's argument, that the United States now was a Gilded Age, because on the surface, you had this immense wealth, you had this growing capitalist economy, you had people making money, living well, you had mansions, you had people, becoming famous, you had the kind of the emergence now of celebrities and things like that, more so than before. But underneath it, what was happening? Well, people were still struggling, maybe even more than they had before. Remember the example I gave earlier, the shoemaker who at one point, had a business where people would come in and order shoes, custom made, and you would make them, and you lived okay that way, you lived fine, right? Well, with the emergence of commercial capitalism, hey, make me 30 pair of shoes and I'll sell them, in a different town. And then eventually the factory system, those artisans are out of work, right? They've lost their jobs. And the same holds true. Most Americans at the time were small farmers, in both the North and South. So as things get bigger, these smaller companies find it more difficult to stay in business. And that's 2020, right? Look around at how many places are going to be, or probably already are, shuttered because of what's happened just this year, right? And so that is not surprisingly the case too. So what you have then, as a result of that, you have these challenges to this new capitalist system, this Gilded Age, right? And so what does that mean? Well, you have the formation of class, right? Now, classes are kind of groups of people in a similar economic condition, right? So in the United States, we generally say everybody's in the middle class, right? But that's kind of an easy way to do it. I mean, you obviously have people who are very wealthy, right? Very well off, incredibly affluent. They can be referred to as the upper class or the ruling class or oligarchs or aristocrats. There's a bunch of names people use to describe them, right? And then you do have some people in the middle class, people who maybe have a profession, and then a lot of people are just working class people, and they, may do okay, they may struggle. They are kind of in the people who are have the most kind of precarious economic conditions. They're always kind of closer to being on the edge of real problems because they don't have a lot of money saved up. I mean, today in 2020, the typical American has like $400 saved up, right? Not a lot of money, right? So, and there have always been people who've been different. I mean, forever, right? But industrial classes are different. They're kind of a little more set. They're less mobile. So what you had because of industrialization now is the formation of an industrial working class. So now those people who go work in factories or even on farms, that often you hire workers, to be on farms, are working class. They don't control those means of production that we talked about. They don't own the factories. They don't own the machines. They don't own the railroads. They don't own the coal. They don't own the coal. They don't own the ore. They don't own the farms, right? They're working for somebody else. So they're working for somebody else. They don't have access to capital. They don't have a lot of money saved up. They can't go into a bank and get a loan to build a factory or a coal mine. And there we go. Jesus, Patso. They are an industrial working class. And as we'll see, they recognize themselves as that. So there's an awareness that they're different and that they are not part of this new industrial capitalist system that's can make great wealth, right? There's also a change in work culture. Now, I don't think this link is up. It's a song which I may or may not try later. Work culture simply refers to the way workers live. And again, going back to the old ways. Remember, if you own if you're a shoemaker or anything really, people control their own work lives. So they could make shoes. If they didn't want to work that day, they didn't have to. If they, they controlled their schedule. If you're in agriculture, you do it based on the seasons, planting and harvesting and all that kind of stuff. If you had a small group of people who worked, let's say, barrel workers or furniture maker, whatever, you might go in one day and play cards, or if it was really nice out, you might go to the beach or something like that. That's called work culture, right? With industrialization, you can't do that anymore. Now, what do? If you're working for somebody else, you can't say, I'm not going to work. You have to go in when you're scheduled to go in. You clock in and you work however many hours a day. There's no 8-hour workday. So it can be 10 hours, it might be 12 hours. It's generally 6 days a week as well, right? The reason it's called a free labor system is you sell your labor. You freely sell it. So I say, I'm going to give you 12 hours a day for 6 hours a week, and you have to give me $2 a day in return, right? So it's considered a free contract now. Obviously, one side has way more power than the other, right? But that's why it's called a free labor system. And I, offer my labor, my time, or whatever, and I get a price for that. I get a wage for it. So, my work culture has changed dramatically. One big part of that, which working people talked about all the time, was that they had to give up what they called Saint Monday. What's that mean? If you're like a Catholic, probably all religions do this. You have different days which are, commemorate different saints, right? So workers joked that Monday was a holy day. They called it Saint Monday Day because quite often on the weekends they went out and they drank and they played cards or danced or whatever. And on Monday morning, they didn't really feel like going to work. So they might sleep in, they might go to the building, the workshop, and sweep it or clean their tools or whatever, but really not get much done. So they jokingly refer to that as Saint Monday, right? I don't know if I'm not going to play it even if it is up, but I don't know if it's still on there. Oh yeah, it is. Okay, so you should listen to this later. It's a song by one of the folk singers from England, Billy Bragg, called Saint Monday. And it's good. It's a good way to kind of understand that. But these are the lyrics too. I'm a hardworking fellow, but I ain't working on a Monday. Saying Monday's still the weekend to me, and that's important there, right? So they understand now that their lives have changed, right? They no longer control their own businesses. They don't own their own shoemaking shop or their own tailor's shop or dressmaker shop or furniture maker, whatever. Big business factories will come and displace them, which is fairly easy to understand and comprehend, right? But their work lives have changed too. The culture of their own work has changed, right? So no longer can they work at their own pace. No longer can they go out and drink when they want to. In fact, a lot of factory owners would go to the local churches, the local ministers, and they would create groups to convince the workers that they should be sober, temperance societies, sobriety societies, because they need, they would work better that way. And, it's good for you. It's better. You're better for your family, all this. You're not going out and drinking and so forth. But there's a clear attempt to change the culture of workers. And again, we're seeing that today, especially with surveillance, right? Where you're kind of always on the clock and there's always somebody looking at you and that kind of thing. That's what they were complaining about. And that's what they complained about a lot when they lost St. Monday, right? So there's a massive change in work culture too. You also have a bigger gap now between skilled and unskilled workers with industrialization. Now, skilled and unskilled kind of describe themselves, right? A skilled worker can make a pair of shoes. A skilled worker can make a cabinet. A skilled worker can make a suit, right? And an unskilled worker is somebody who tends to work at an assembly line at a factory, who does something that's pretty repetitive and doesn't require a lot of training or a lot of know-how. You can kind of do it. Now, in the artisanal economy, before industrialization, you get a lot of skilled workers, right? But as factories came in and displaced them, they became de-skilled. And in a sense, they lost their skills, right? Now, not everybody did. You still have skilled workers. You still have people, especially as the 19th century goes further in, who, you'll get plumbers, electricians, tailors. You still have people who want nice, custom-made clothing. Not me, obviously. So you do have skilled workers, but a lot of people now are unskilled. They work in coal mines, or they'll work in a factory, or they'll stoke, coal into the furnace of a railroad, that kind of thing. There's a big difference. Skilled workers have a lot more, kind of power in the workplace. They have more leverage. They're paid more. They make more money. You can't get rid of them as easily because they have a skill. So, if you're in a factory and your workers say, we want to get paid more, you just get rid of them, and they're easy to replace because there's other people out there, right? If a group of plumbers say, we want to get paid more, that's harder to do. You can't just grab people in off the streets and, have them fix all your plumbing or do electrical work or make a suit or whatever, right? So there's a gap there. Now, the people who were and by far the larger number, but the people who are generally more discontented with this new capitalist system are the unskilled workers. They're the ones who really now are working for a wage. So they're going to a factory, they're going to a coal mine, they're working on the railroads, whatever, Now, if you're a railroad engineer, that's a skill, right? But if you're just, a fireman who's, keeping the thing going, that's not really skilled work. So they don't have much leverage. They can't go in and say, I want to talk to the boss, I want more money, this isn't a safe place to work. Railroads were incredibly dangerous. Thousands of people killed on the railroads, just working the railroads. But you don't really have, because they can replace you very easily. I want vacation. If you're sick, you just get replaced, right? So you don't really have much leverage in the workplace if you're unskilled. And because of that, you had this emergence of critics like Twain calling it the Gilded Age. But one of the groups best known for this was a group that emerged in the late 19th, early 20th century called the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW or the Wobblies. And they made this up and they sold it, and they sold gazillions of copies. I don't know how many they sold in the early 1900s. I'm sure it wasn't gazillions, but it was a lot. And anyway, it was the way they described capitalism, right? Now, you don't have to look at it this way or whatever. My point is, this is how critics of the system as it was developing saw it, all right? So at the very top, you have money, capital, right? So that's capitalism. That's what's most important now at the top of this pyramid. It's capital, right? It's not agriculture. It's not like a feudal system or anything like that. It's capitalism, okay? And then it says, we rule you, all right? So who are the people in charge? Prime ministers, presidents, you know, people like that. And which means that they're in charge, but they're below capital, right? So the people who rule you, these prime ministers, these presidents, these kings, are all kind of doing the work of a higher source, right? Capital. And then below that, which is interesting, it says, we fool you. And these are ministers, popes, and, you know, patriarchs and people like that. And the critics of capitalism often invoked this because these religious figures were being used to convince workers that they should accept and embrace and be obedient in this new system, right? And so this is a big theme, right? Because quite often, you know, if you want a new church built, some of the local, you know, businessmen in town would come in and they would donate the money to build a church, right? Or they would give you money for whatever, right? And so there's this tension now because a lot of these immigrant communities often were very religious. You know, religion is very important in their societies and their cultures. Yet now they're starting to see that these people, these ministers, these theologians are on the side of the businessman, not on their side. And in fact, there's a very famous song, songwriter who was associated with the Wobblies, the IWW, named Joe Hill, wrote a song called The Long-Haired Preacher, which, you know, I'm not going to play it here, but you can play it and look at the lyrics as you go on. But the point of it is that these ministers are telling you to accept your plight here on earth, even if you don't like what you're doing, even if it's really hard work, because you get rewarded in heaven, which is the same thing that plantation ministers often told slaves too. Just, you know, accept your plight here because you'll be rewarded in heaven. So that's part of the critique. We fool you. We shoot at you. And that's something in 2020 we're seeing, right? So who's this? These are the militias, the police, the guardsmen, the armies, whoever, right? And what is their role? When there's some kind of civil disobedience, what they consider disobedience, right? When people are challenging the status quo, they are called out, right? The purpose of these forces, these police and militia, and they were created in the early 1800s during this period of industrialization, both in Europe and the United States. Their primary goal, the reason they were created, was to protect the property and the interests of these new industrial capitalists. So they're there to protect factories because a bunch of workers might get angry and want to burn the factory down, or they might get angry at the boss and want to go to his mansion and, you know, like they're doing protests today. You know, sometimes you see people go to like the mayor's house or some rich person's house or something like that. So police forces were created for that reason, to protect the interests, to protect the property, to protect the people who were running those companies, running those businesses, and who were also obviously very important in politics as well. Now, the irony, of course, is that many of those people in the army and the police and the militia and so forth are from the working class. So they're often, you know, kind of going up against their own people, right? So, and that's part of the critique, right? Critics of capitalism say, you're hiring, you know, our own people to keep us in line, right? Then below that, we eat for you. And this is a bunch of rich people having a party, drinking champagne and all that kind of stuff, right? And then in the critic's mind, the most important element in this class pyramid is down here. They're holding it all up. They're holding up all these fat cats and all this money and everything else. We work for all, industrial working class, and we feed all, farmers, all right? So that's the social pyramid that they now see, that was created because of industrial capitalism, right? So it's a different system than before. People don't have the same sovereignty, the same autonomy they did when they own their own, you know, shoemaking shop or whatever. They don't have the same work culture where they can work when they want to, when they can call in sick, when they can have Saint Monday, whenever they feel like it, right? So everything's very different. So this leads to a very harsh critique and a lot of discontent So although capitalism was now the dominant industry, it wasn't accepted by everybody. And in fact, what we're going to see is a huge, long period of people rejecting this new system. There is a great deal of conflict and even violent conflict in American society. And this is something that really isn't, kind of well known. But in the period right after the Civil War, starting in like the 1870s or so, all the way through actually well into the 20th century, you had a sustained level of industrial conflict and even violence, right? Workers against bosses, labor against capital, right? So that's not at all uncommon, and it's a really important theme in this entire period. So we're going to talk about that now. Over here, these are the specific pages in the book. Decided to do you a favor, but you really do need to read everything as well. But there's a lot there. I'm certainly not going to be able to cover anywhere near all of this stuff. That's why I put the pages up there, but make sure you read all this. As I said, when it comes time for tests, we'll probably let you have the book there because it's an online exam anyway, but you really need to know it. You can't just like kind of go in there not having ever, looked at the book and do it, because you're going to have to kind of know what to look for and where to look and all that kind of stuff, right? So what I'm talking about is this, and this is really important, this long sustained period of class violence, because I think it's important to understand, even though we have this system, it wasn't like inevitable. It wasn't like ordained, right? People say, oh, it's ordained. God wants you to be capitalist or whatever. It was a decision made by a particular group of individuals, especially people who had power, to have this kind of economic system where private ownership of the means of production would dominate. People who had capital, people who own factories, people who own railroads and machine tie-in, tool and die companies and things like that, had not just economic power, but political power. So that's what we're dealing with here. A lot of people aren't happy about it. All right. So this leads to, what Twain called the Gilded Age. I might do this for a minute here, just to stretch, so excuse me if it looks weird. So this is what Twain called the Gilded Age, and it's also a period of sustained labor conflict, right? Workers were not happy, and so workers started forming unions. Now, I don't know if, unions aren't that popular today. There aren't that many people in unions, about 10% of American workers are, but there was a time when they were far more important. A union is an organization of workers. They all get together in a union. They unionize. They come together and unify, because that way they can approach the bosses with more power. If not, you approach them individually. So if you want more money, if you want some kind of different work rules, some kind of vacation or some kind of health standards or something like that, you would have to do it individually, right? One thing I didn't realize is I hope my voice was okay from that distance. If not, sorry. I'll know after I watch this. If you did it individually, you'd have no power, right? If you go to the boss as an individual and say, hey, I want more money, or this is unsafe, these conditions are unsafe, and they just get rid of you, right? But if you join together and create a union and you go collectively, the whole group of you goes, then it's a lot harder to get rid of everybody, right? So you have some power there. So there had been attempts to create unions at various times, even before the Civil War. But after the Civil War, it became a much bigger issue because of this emergence of all these new industries, steel and coal and iron and all the other stuff like that, right? So this led to a period of sustained conflict because life was rough. In addition to this transition from the kind of artisans to this industrial capitalism with factories and everything else, and this change, in work culture, people's lives were really upended. They were very different, right? And in addition to that, the economy after the Civil War was kind of up and down all the time too. There were, kind of depressions and recessions and all that kind of stuff. Remember, the South kind of wiped out. During the war, the South had created its own money, Confederate money, which is worthless. So you have these major problems with money and things like that as well. And the book actually talks about that kind of stuff, right? So you have all these problems now. Workers aren't being paid well. There are depressions. There are periods where there's a lot of unemployment. And this will lead to long periods of sustained conflict as a result of that, right? Now, this is occurring all the time, and I'm not going to go into it and give you a play-by-play of every major conflict in this period. What I'm going to do is talk about 3 or 4 of the bigger ones, but it's really essential, I think, particularly in this case, to read about what's actually going on, because it's happening all over the country. It's well, mostly in the North, but it's really critical to the way that this new system is created. All right. So what we're going to do, even though this is going on all the time, is kind of focus on these: the Great Uprising, Haymarket, Homestead, and Pullman, all of which are covered in some detail in the book. All right. So the Great Uprising began in 1877, and the Great Uprising is probably in some ways the biggest labor action in U.S. history, because it involved probably more people and was broader than anywhere else. It was a national movement, and it began with railroad workers. Railroad workers saw their wages as diminishing. There were depressions. 1873, there was a really bad depression. They called it panics. A panic. Back then, a depression was called a panic, an economic panic. People panicked, and they, all that kind of stuff, right? So panic and depression are used for economic conditions, right? So if you had, Xanax and Prozac, you would have been able to take care of it, but they didn't have either of those yet. So they had to deal with it. And one way they dealt with it was through labor organization and ultimately, violent confrontation based on class struggle. Remember, these workers see themselves as part of a working class, right? They're part of a group of people nationally who do the same things. They work. They also believe that they provide wealth. They're the ones who are doing this stuff, right? They're making the steel. They're mining coal, they're growing crops. So they see themselves as having a very valuable, vital role in society, but they're not getting paid very much for it. And they're losing their jobs, there's unemployment, there's all kinds of problems, right? There's obviously no social safety net. So you don't have health care, you don't have Social Security, you don't have Medicare, anything like that obviously doesn't exist. So it's a rough life for these workers. So in 1877, workers on the railroads were particularly hard hit. A lot of the railroads were cutting back, and they were cutting wages on workers. So finally, workers had enough. They just said, "We're tired of this." So in 1877, in Martinsburg, West Virginia, a group of railroad workers just said, "We're not working anymore." So they went on what was called nowadays we would call it a Wildcat Strike. And we've actually seen some this year, like Amazon and some other companies who just said, like, well, we're not working anymore. Some of the people, when COVID hit, some of the people in the meatpacking plants refused to go to work because it was dangerous and so forth. We now call that a Wildcat Strike. It's a spontaneous strike. It's not like you get together, you have a meeting, you vote or anything like that. So in Martinsburg, all these workers went on strike on the railroad. And word of that got around, people started putting it on Instagram and tweeting it and putting it on Facebook and all that kind of stuff. And so pretty soon, other railroad workers in Baltimore and in Louisville and Cleveland and other places like that went on strike as well. So the railroad workers are having kind of a solidarity strike, right? A sympathy strike, whatever you want to call it. They're saying, these guys in Martinsburg went out, and our situation is the same as theirs. So it's actually not a sympathy strike. It's actually more directly related to that on the railroads. So they go on strike too. So you have this railroad strike. And then what's really remarkable is that workers in other industries, in steel and in iron, coal, whatever, they too decided to go on a strike in solidarity with the railroad workers. So you had a national uprising in 1877. You now have basically American industry is being shut down, which is really unbelievable. It's really staggering. Nothing like that had happened even up to this point. I don't think anything since then like that has gone on, right? So you have this massive national strike. Now, what happens when you have a strike? Ultimately, the folks who run the businesses, who own the railroads, who own the factories and everything else, they're not going to negotiate with you. There's no recognized union. So eventually they're going to use force. So they called out the police. And in some places, like in Pittsburgh, the police threw their weapons down and joined the strikers. So for about a week, the strikers led the city of Pittsburgh. They took over running Pittsburgh, right? That didn't happen in very many places. And the police throwing their weapons down and joining the strikes is pretty rare as well. But, this is a national thing. So it gets violent. The militias are called out. The National Guard kind of units are called out. vigilantes and things like that. So it gets very, ugly. It gets very violent. Here's some images of it. So this is interesting, right? There is a bridge being burned down. Why is a bridge being burned down? To prevent the trains from going across. So strikers would, burn down a bridge in order to monkey wrench, to mess up the operations of the railroad company they worked for. So it got very violent that way. That's from the 1877 strike, right? Eventually, the strike was suppressed. Workers, in some industries, overall, it wasn't victorious, right? And the book will give you detail, way more detail on it. These strikes are rarely victorious. Capital has so much more power in so many different ways. They obviously have wealth, they have money, they have access to the police and the military and the militias, the courts, they can get the courts to, make people go back to work and things like that. The media will obviously write stories talking about how horrible the people on strike are. They would often point out that they're not born in the United States. Many of them came from, Germany and Ireland and places like that. They use the word terrorists sometimes to describe them. So the stuff you're hearing today in 2020 isn't brand new. It's not the first time that's ever come up. It's actually been used quite a bit, right? So the Great Uprising, did get a lot of American workers fired up, and it led to the creation of probably the biggest national union established at that point, something called the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor was a national organization of all workers. It was an organization of what were called producers, people who made things. Workers saw themselves as producers. They actually made the stuff. The bankers didn't make stuff, and the people who owned the factories didn't make stuff. The workers made the stuff, right? So the Knights of Labor was open to anybody who was a producer, who was a worker. The only groups that were not allowed in, were prostitutes and gamblers and lawyers, right? Which is a shame that they had to insult prostitutes and gamblers that way, right? See, if we were in class, you'd all be laughing right now. Anyway, the Knights of Labor claimed like 1 million members, and they believed in a society based on cooperatives where the workers would own the businesses, right? Which it's not quite socialism, but it's a lot like it, right? The Knights of Labor had, after the Great Uprising, even grew in membership, right? One of their main goals, their demands, all workers at the time, was the creation of a national law for an 8-hour workday. At the time, your workday was based on whatever you agreed to, and most people worked, like I said, 10, 12-hour, 6-day-a-week workdays were not uncommon. That was kind of typical. So what they wanted was an 8-hour workday. They said 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, 8 hours for whatever you want, what you will, right? And there were various, rallies and demonstrations for this 8-hour day. And in 1886, this kind of came to a head in Chicago because a couple of things were going on. There was a major strike going on at the McCormick Reaper Works. They made farm equipment. So there's a strike going on. It's getting ugly. It's getting violent. There's also this movement for an 8-hour day. I'm cutting the story way short, so make sure you read about it. Anyway, McCormick tried to bring in people to replace the workers who are on strike. People who come in to take jobs from people who are on strike are referred to insultingly as scabs, derisively as scabs, right? So McCormick's trying to bring in scab labor. It gets violent, right? And the police obviously take sides with McCormick. And so kind of associated with that, a group in Chicago decides to have a rally in favor, to show support for the strikers in McCormick and to have, this rally for the 8-hour day. They called it for a place called Haymarket. If you've been in Chicago, there's a site called the Haymarket, right? They're there. There's a rally. The rally is organized by people who are fairly radical. Some are anarchists, some are socialists. These are terms thrown about today, which are very much, as they were in 1877, misunderstood. And all of a sudden, violence broke out. Somebody threw a bomb. Nobody knows if it was somebody who was there, one of the anarchists. Maybe it was a policeman who was trying to disrupt everything, to make a mess of it. And all hell broke loose, and several people were shot. And the people who organized the rally were all arrested. I think 11 of them were arrested, and many were given the death penalty. So what this did was show the counterattack by capital, by the bosses, that they were gonna, hold on to power and do it violently if they needed to, right? So Haymarket is very important in the history of labor, and still is there. There's a scene where this is, kind of one of the guys talking, and I believe in the book, The Reader that you have on text and speeches, I think one of the August Spies, I believe, speech is in there, one of the Haymarket martyrs, they called them. 4 of them were actually hanged as a result of that. But he's giving a speech, and the police all show up, and they start shooting, and it turns into bedlam, right? And this is another Haymarket image. Well, no, it isn't. It used to be. It wasn't until a couple weeks ago. Anyway, I wonder if that's a coincidence, warning signs of dementia for me, right? Anyway, so Haymarket it's a loss. It's a real blow to labor, right? So workers now, they understand that the whole power of the state is against them. The bosses are against them. The state, the police, the militia, the courts. So, but they still continue this attempt to organize, to unionize. Now, skilled workers. Remember when I talked about that earlier? Skilled workers. It's easier for them to unionize because, like I said, they have a skill. They're not as easily replaced. Unskilled workers usually aren't unionized for that reason. Now, so the next major battle occurred in 1892 in Pennsylvania, a place called Homestead. This is a steel mill. Homestead was unionized. It was the only mill in that area that was. Homestead was purchased by the famous steel industrialist, Andrew Carnegie. And Andrew Carnegie's kind of right-hand man, you ever seen The Simpsons, like Burns and Smithers? I forgot to put a picture up. I was going to put a picture of Burns up, but, like Carnegie's like Burns, right? And Smithers is the right-hand man, and Carnegie's right-hand man was Henry Clay Frick. So we sent Frick to Homestead. Carnegie has this great reputation. He was a philanthropist. He built libraries. He gave money away to poor people and, all that kind of stuff. So he sent Frick to Homestead and he said, get rid of the union, break it, right? So Frick locked out the workers. So it was a lockout, right? And he was bringing in replacement workers, scabs. The guys who worked there found out about it, and when the new workers, the scab workers, approached on a barge, they opened fire on them, so it became very violent, right? And this led to kind of a battle of Homestead. Ultimately, Frick went to court. They got injunctions against the people who used to work there, the union guys. They were put on a list, so they were never hired. They weren't able to be hired. Some were given prison sentences. So the strike again was crushed at Homestead. So again, it shows this power that capital that the bosses had, right? And then 2 years later, one of the more famous incidents in American history is the famous Pullman Strike. And I'm going through this very quickly. I'm just mentioning them. There's a lot more detail, like I said, in the book, right? Pullman's interesting because Pullman was a motor car company. They made the coaches for trains. People used to travel by train, and some of them it could be very luxurious. There'd be these cars with sleeping quarters, and they'd have dining rooms and bars and things like that. And Pullman was the company that did that. Pullman and a lot of coal mining towns are like this as well. Pullman didn't just own the company, but he owned the town. So Pullman Motor Car Company was in Pullman, Illinois. The people who worked there worked for Pullman, and they lived in Pullman, Illinois. They shopped at the Pullman store. They went to Pullman's doctor, right? They were paid in Pullman money. It's called script. They weren't paid in dollars. They were paid in Pullman money, so you could only spend it in Pullman, right, when you worked there, right? Now, the economy is really bad. There was another panic in 1893, another depression. And so Pullman cut wages for his workers, but did not lower rent or the prices in the Pullman stores, right? So as you can imagine, this is a bit of a problem. So some of the railroad workers went to Pullman to complain, and he fired them. So the American Railway Union, led by a guy whose name will come up again, named Eugene Victor Debs, went on strike in 1894. They wanted to recreate what had happened in 1877. They believed that they could start a national strike, and they asked other businesses, industries, other workers in other industries to join them in solidarity, right? It didn't work out that way. the big labor organization at the time was the American Federation of Labor, which was more conservative. They would not join with the American Railway Workers strike at Pullman. And eventually, at the time, it's kind of weird. Like the only time this happened, the governor of Illinois was pro-labor. He refused to call out the National Guard against the workers. So the U.S. Army was called out. The Army came out. Grover Cleveland, president, dispatched the U.S. Army to defeat, this Pullman strike. Remember this past summer when there was talk of Trump calling out the military refused to go because their job is not to actually, engage in conflict on American soil, right? Well, at Pullman they did, right? And so it was defeated. So in this period, and I just mentioned these four, there are way more than that. You have these major uprisings which are occurring all the time, but in each of these cases, capital has power. The political system and the economic system are intertwined. They're virtually the same thing. They're often the same people. They can go to the courts. They can go to the media. The media writes these stories about how horrible the people on strike are. They're foreign workers. They're not from the United States. They don't even speak English, and they're thugs and they're terrorists and all this kind of stuff. And they write beautiful stories about people like Carnegie, who, is a philanthropist, and he gives, money to kids and builds libraries and all this other kind of stuff. And so by 1894, it's very clear that the power of capital is overwhelming, and that in this class conflict, they have most of the power, right? So from the Great Uprising to Pullman, you could see that, and it's going to continue after that too. And there's a lot of it in the book. It's a major theme in 19th and 20th century America, is this conflict between people who have power and then working people, right? And working people stand up, they fight. It does become violent at times. There are organizations. The Knights of Labor kind of faded after Haymarket because people, saw that there were problems associated with it. There were risks involved. Also, when the economy went bad, a lot of people just lost their jobs. So it was very hard to sustain a union movement. You don't really see that in unskilled work until the 1930s, really. So it's very hard to do that. So you have this sustained period. So, to kind of go back to where we were in the first lecture, right? You have this new capitalist system, which creates an immense economy, coal production, steel production, machinery, massive increases in all of that, which means there's massive wealth. People like Carnegie, people like Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, bankers, just immense amounts of wealth, immense profits in all these new industries, coal and iron and steel and factories of all kinds, and even big agriculture. So there's an immense amount of money. But most people aren't participating in that economy. Many people have lost their old lives. They no longer feel like they're producers. They're working for somebody else now in a factory, getting $2 for a 10-hour day or $1.50. Wages, and we'll talk about this later. Wages were also adjusted based on like white men got more, women and African Americans were paid much less. Children worked. There were no child labor laws, so you had kids 8, 9, 10 years old. Who were working in factories, right? I have a couple images from Pullman. Let me see if these came up. All right, this is interesting, right? So this is a photo, right, from 1894, and this is a Pullman train, right, a Pullman motor car, and look who's on top of it, right? The militia, the army. So they're defending private. Now keep in mind, this is private property, right? So the government is not neutral. The government's supposed to be neutral. No, remember when we said that earlier, like how the government takes care of capital? This is a great example of it, right? So the army is defending Pullman. They're on the train defending the Pullman Motor Car Company, right? And here is a photo, and it's the same thing. The train is now running, and you have the army in front of it, protecting it from all these people who are there. I'm assuming there's the people who are on strike, right? So again, even though it's a private business, the government is not neutral. The government takes sides. It sends the army out to defend and protect this private company against workers who have their wages cut, but still have to pay the same rent and the same prices at the company store and everything else. So this is a really good case study, a good example of how capitalism was developed in the late 19th century with government support, heavy government support to the point where they would send troops out, in fact, to defend those interests. All right. So that's what's happening in industrial America. A lot of people are not happy with this new system. To a lot of them, it's a gilded age. It looks pretty on the outside, but underneath it, there's a lot of problems. And there's problems in the Great Uprising. There's problems in Haymarket, at Homestead, at Pullman, and a lot of other places, right? Now, these issues occurred in industrial areas. However, you have similar problems, similar conflicts occurring in farm areas too, in agricultural areas, right? So at the same time, you have these uprisings, these rebellions, these strikes, whatever you want to call them, in Haymarket, in Homestead, Pullman, and a lot of other places. It's occurring on farms as well. So you have a period of agrarian uprisings. Now, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that since we're close to hitting the time limit, although I'm being kind of loose with that because, you know, like I said, you don't have to get out of class and go to another building. There are also problems on the farms. This new capitalist political economy has also changed the nature of farming. A lot of people, most Americans, in fact, had small farms. They were subsistence farms, family farms. What's a subsistence farm? Subsistence farm. What's a family farm? It's a farm you own yourself, your family. You tend to it. You grow crops on it. Maybe you raise, you know, some kind of livestock, and you generally survive. You subsist off of what you produce. So it's very much a producer's ethic, a producer's economy. You make the stuff you need to live. You grow the crops you need. You might have, you know, chickens or a pig or whatever as well. If you have a little extra, you might sell it at a farmer's market, but you're not producing goods to sell to other people. You're producing goods principally to use yourself, all right? So that's a family farm or a subsistence farm, right? And that's the typical farm. Well, after the Civil War, agriculture expands as well. Now in the South, you had major, you know, plantations, obviously, in cotton and sugar and tobacco and all that kind of thing. That becomes more the norm after the Civil War. So a lot of farmers see their lives, it's like the transformation up north from kind of being artisans, you know, making shoes or whatever, to becoming a factory worker. In agricultural America now, a lot of people see a transition from family to commercial farming. What's that mean? Family farms, like I said, you're kind of growing stuff principally to subsist on. Commercial farms, you're growing stuff for a market. So instead of, you know, just growing enough of a bunch of different things to keep your family going, now you're going to try to grow a lot of something to sell to other people, to sell to a much bigger national market, actually, right? So what does that mean? A bunch of people who used to hold land have lost it. Some people couldn't afford to pay their notes. There were all kinds of depressions. There were environmental problems in places like Nebraska, Indiana, the Midwest area there, Kansas, places like that, those farm areas, Iowa. Huge numbers of people just left. They lost their land. They couldn't afford it anymore. They couldn't grow crops. Big agricultural corporations came in and bought the land up, or they purchased a bank and then called in the land notes. So you have a massive dislocation of farmers. Now, just like somebody who used to make shoes may have ended up working in a shoe factory, a lot of people who used to own their own farms, their own family farms, end up working as laborers on somebody else's big farm, corporate agriculture, agricultural corporation, right? And this is going to lead to problems like the ones we just talked about up north, because these farmers, like the Knights of Labor, had a producer's self-image. Workers saw themselves as very vital as producers. It was really important to them. They made the stuff that kept people going, right? They, in the North, they made iron, they made steel, they made railroad cars that would take people from one place to another. They took great pride in that. Farmers, obviously producers, right? There, remember in that pyramid, right at the bottom, we work for all, we feed all. Farmers fed people. They did the most important thing in society that they believed that you could, right? Which is provide food. They provided subsistence. They provided life for everybody else, right? So they were vital. They were produced. They were very proud of that. And now, not so much. Like the workers up north in industries, right? In factories, now they're working for a wage on somebody else's land, right? So all of that is coming into play, just like it is in the North in the 1870s and so. And just like in the North, you had the Knights of Labor and all these strikes, you're going to see political action in the South as well, right? You're going to have groups of farmers get together, form organizations, and that's going to lead to, maybe the most important alternative political party, political challenge in American history, the Populists. And we're going to talk a bit about that because that's really important, because that word is thrown around a lot today. We hear about populists all the time, and it's not quite what the original populist, meant it to be. I don't think that word really means what you think it means, right? Kind of thing. So we're gonna do all that when we pick up next time. So this is the end of lecture 2, which kind of will be like week 1. So you can watch these, based on your own schedule. Check in on Blackboard. We'll have any announcements or anything you need to know up there. No hurry on testing or anything like that. That's not imminent. If you have any questions about, anything really about the syllabus or anything like that, let us know. If you want to pursue something further that I said in this, check the book, but also feel free to contact any of us, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Read, stay on top of things, stay in touch. Naomi Judd said, wash your hands and say your prayers, because germs and Jesus are everywhere. So there you go. Wear a mask, be safe, take care of yourselves. We'll see you next time.